All right. Well, I'd just like to say thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Linda Davis, and I am Executive Director for um, the Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario. I'd like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this is sacred land upon which we are privileged to live and work. We recognize the deep connection and the long-standing relationship between Indigenous peoples and the land of southwestern Ontario and of London. This land has supported human beings for at least the past 10,000 years. This land is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Ojibwe or Chippewa Nation, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, which includes the Oneida Nation, the Lenape, also known as the Delaware, the Attawandaron, also known as the Neutral, and the Wendat, also known as the Huron peoples. The Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario continues to support the Indigenous people of Turtle Island and the call for the investigation into the heartbreaking burials of Indigenous children found at former residential schools in Canada. We commit to work towards our own learning and truth seeking, as well as that of our community. Our coalition is a diverse group that includes settlers. We acknowledge that we will never truly understand the pain and devastation suffered by the Indigenous community. We commit our hearts and minds to not only open our eyes and ears to learn, but also to use our voice and actions to stand up as active allies and accomplices to fight for justice. Together, we commit to the work of truth and reconciliation. We are deeply grateful to have the opportunity to be in this place. Wherever you are in your place, we acknowledge that this is just the beginning of a process, and we commit to a continued journey of listening, learning, and building relationships. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. Share. And there we go. Where's my slideshow? There it is. Okay. Okay, here we go. So on behalf of the Coalition to Empower Gender Equality and CFUW London and Wage Canada, here's a list of who we have on our committee at the Coalition and our leadership team. We support the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 for gender equality. We must undo the limiting beliefs. Sorry, just jump back here. Beliefs, stereotypes, and barriers in the home, workplace, education, government, and all areas of our society. So those are the things that we're working towards. How we're going to do that is through a life cycle model. So we're using the life cycle of cradle to grave, basically, to try to understand where those barriers and stereotypes develop and how we can break them down at the various levels as we go through. So we hope to be working with Londoners and people from all over Ontario, but we're starting mainly in London to identify those barriers. We believe that using a collective voice, our vision is to create a community where everyone enjoys the opportunities, responsibilities, and rewards equally, unrestricted by gender identity. Our plan is to connect with local business, community, organizations, municipal governments, schools, school boards, and citizens to identify local barriers to equality, create strategies for change, and use a collective voice to call for gender justice. The coalition, and I'll save that till later. So I'll stop sharing my screen right now. And at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce your moderator for the evening, is Alex Pershai. He's the coalition board member, or I should say Dr. Alex Pershai, a coalition board member and a motivated equality, diversity, and inclusion specialist with graduate level knowledge of gender and, sorry, I'm just gonna take 1 second there, sorry. Gender and equality, anti-racism and equity, diversity and inclusion. Alex has a proven track record of working with issues related to gender-based analysis, minority rights, vulnerable population support, immigration, including several as one of the experts of the United Nations Population Fund, and UNDP project, Gender in Development. Alex conducts research and situational analysis, provides recommendations aligning to strategies, strategic goals, development, outreach initiatives, designs learning materials, and training programs. Currently, Alex leads the research, data collection, and strategic planning for the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion initiatives at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario. Alex, I apologize for messing that up, but I will turn it over to Alex now and the rest of your evening. Thank you.
No worries at all. Thank you, Linda, for the introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Terrance Kernaghan is the Member of Provincial Parliament for London North Centre. He is passionate about social justice, healthcare, housing, and education. Before politics, he was an elementary school teacher librarian focusing on critical literacy, digital citizenship, media literacy, and social justice. As MPP, Terrance represents his community's needs and interests at Queen's Park in London, Ontario. And moving on, welcome, Terrance. Dr. Annalise Trudell is a gender equity consultant and the manager of education, training, and research at ANOVA, the Women's Shelter and Sexual Assault Centre in London, Ontario. She brings extensive analysis of the causes and impacts of gender-based violence and of prevention programming through her doctoral and postdoctoral research at Western University. As manager at ANOVA for over a decade, she has overseen the facilitation, curriculum development, and evaluation of youth anti-violence programming and professional trainings. She is a seasoned public educator and facilitator with over 500 lectures and presentations engaging youth, professionals, and post-secondary students through public education. Welcome, Annalise. And last but not least, Christopher Wolff, who is a community facilitator, writer, and advocate currently residing in Tiohtià:ke or Montreal. I hope I said that right. He's a founding member of Trans Tipping Point Project, now Gender Generations Project in Victoria, British Columbia, and co-developed the Trans Newcomers Online Resource Hub, a resource platform for transgender and gender diverse newcomers to British Columbia. Christopher is also a PhD student in the humanities program at Concordia University, where he is undertaking research on transgender art activism. Welcome, Christopher. And it is my great pleasure to start with panel with the question of what does gender justice means? What does gender justice mean to you? How about we'll start with you, Terrance?
Thank you very much, Alex. Gender justice means equality and equity, regardless of your gender label or lack thereof. It's moving beyond the hierarchical, the sort of the non-binary structure into something more of I tend to think when we look at it as a hierarchy, we tend to think of power. Instead, we should think of gender as being more of a continuum or more of a circle, because hierarchies and binary oppositions are frequently antagonistic. And, I think everyone, regardless, should be valued for their contributions. Gender justice is equal pay for equal work. It's also support for mothers and sole support parents. It's, getting away from this idea that there are intrinsic or innate qualities based on your biology.
Well, thank you, Terrance. And Annalise, what about you? What do you think?
So for me, it's important to focus on the word justice. Justice is an act, and it's an act forward, a way forward that centers accountability. And so when we're talking about gender, often we've talked about oppression or violence targeted because of gender. And that's really important. It's important to focus on survivors. It's important to focus on the oppression, but it's equally important to focus on who is doing it and the sense of accountability that's needing to be paved forward for us to kind of get past that and get to a place of equity. So we need to harness sort of the focus being on the perpetrators or on those committing oppression who have privilege and engaging them in sort of a focused accountability space.
Absolutely. Thank you, Annalise. And Christopher, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what Terrance and Annalise have said so far. It's definitely about equality and equity, but I think Annalise really raised an important point. And if we're looking at the word justice, then yeah, like she said, it's much more about like a doing thing. If we think about the term justice in particular, an example would be an issue that's literally a question of survival, which is the ongoing deadly violence that trans feminine folks experience, particularly trans women of color. And with that, as of the moment, very little is done to prevent these deaths, and there's equally little done, sadly, to bring the perpetrators to trial. So that's one instance where gender justice is literally a question of survival. So I agree, it's something that needs to be looked at both in like who's affected and who's like perpetrating, and it's also something that can't really be thought of as a single issue as well, because like it's not just about gender, but it's also all these other factors that make up human beings and that often lead to multiple marginalization.
Thank you, Christopher. Let's move on to our next question. From your perspective, does the LGBTQ plus movement include all genders and treat them equally? What has been your experience with this issue? Maybe we'll start with Annalise with this question.
I think that's a really complicated, nuanced, historically situated question. And so I think in the past, or arguably very presently so as well, the needs of gay, cis men have been really forefronted in this movement. And other needs, so the needs of trans folk, the needs of non-binary folk, the needs of femme, lesbians in my case, have not been sort of at the forefront of calls for the need and the identity of the movement. And I think that's shifted for sure over time. And so I think that is why it's important to historically center that. But I don't think that's gone away. I still think that there's a character to the movement that often prioritizes those needs. And in my case, so as a lesbian, as a woman who is feminine and in that way often passes as being straight, my identity as a queer woman is often either hypersexualized in sort of like a girl on girl porn type vibe and sort of co-opted away from me, or it's sort of marginalized within the community as not seen as sort of central and being core to that movement. And I think, yeah, just looking at, there's all kinds of people that would have a similar narrative to that around who are sort of on the periphery of this movement.
Thank you, Annalise. And Christopher, what's your experience?
Yeah, I'm gonna go out on a limb and answer your first question with no. It does not include all genders and treat them equally. I would say there's even an argument to be made to hesitate to speak of a LGBTQ plus and so on movement or community, because I think the community is really fractured into a lot of different sub-communities, and there's unfortunately rare that they are really united as a whole movement or community. But for the sake of the argument, if we think of LGBTQ plus as a single community or movement, then yes, there are obviously like clear hierarchies along gender, so cisgender, racial background, white, and sexuality, which would be gay, or like with some also like lesbian, I would include that in that. And then obviously other factors as economic income, age, knowledge of English or French, if you're talking about Canada, being able-bodied. So the folks who are multiply marginalized in that way do often lack voice or access to the movement, or are even being intentionally excluded from spaces and resources, I would say. And obviously there's also, unfortunately, still a lot of resistance from the more privileged groups within the community to acknowledge the struggles of more marginalized community members. And also like sort of a hesitance to ally themselves with them. Yeah, we can think about, for example, the issue of trans rights. I'm also thinking of things like police participating in pride events, racism, obviously, with like, we had, especially like last year, Black Lives Matter movement. Also even thinking about things like the recent backlash against kink in Pride. So these are all instances where there's really like more of a fracture or like a exclusion than inclusion, I would say.
Thank you, Christopher. And Terrance, what has been your experience?
Well, my experience, I come at it as a white cisgender gay man, so I do enjoy a certain amount of privilege. You know, I would say that the community has come quite a long way. You know, we now see that there are trans members hosting community events, being more visible, being more, you know, proud in themselves, and you know, taking space, which is what we need. And we need to make sure that we're also providing that space and listening. Because as has been mentioned, we know that trans women of color are subject to some of the most terrible violence, you know, imaginable. You know, we need to make sure that the queer movement is always growing and always being more inclusive. You know, there are queer folks with disabilities, and that people are included regardless of their age, race, religion, or their ability. You know, this week is actually non-binary awareness week, and that's yet another important thing for people to really try to understand, and to begin to understand folks who are genderqueer and who don't ascribe to, you know, those standard labels that everyone's familiar with. You know, I think if I had something to say to the broader community, is that, you know, it's okay to not know all the answers. It's okay to ask questions from a place of respect. And it's okay to also have your thoughts and ideas challenged. I think regardless of who you are and your identity, that we all have learning to do. We all have listening that we must do. And we're all growing as, you know, we develop and we progress as a society.
Thank you, Terrance. And that brings us to our next question, actually. What are your thoughts on how London or your local community could move from symbolic representation of LGBTQ plus issues to more action-based movements or activities? Let's start with you, Christopher, this time.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think it's really an interesting thing to think about, like symbolic actions versus sort of more concrete actions. I think obviously one thing is to continue to work on removing barriers and to increase equal access to resources. For example, that can look like lobbying municipal governments and agencies, schools and school boards. One thing that is current is like more is like gender neutral language. It's also something very sort of plain and simple, which is the access to, you know, gender neutral washrooms. That's one issue that is really like sort of, it's a basic necessity, and it's something that can be like relatively easily addressed by, you know, municipalities and other agencies, like taking steps to ensure that that's being offered. Yeah, I'm also thinking that a lot of the more concrete actions that we need to take to sort of improve equality have really system changing relevance. So these are actions that will get not just you know, the LGBTQ community, but really everyone get access to better healthcare, employment, housing, and protection from violence. So these are things that are really beneficial to everybody and not just the LGBT community. So these are things I think we need to fight for, regardless of like things like gender identity and sexuality.
Thank you, Christopher. And Terrance, what do you think about that?
You know, it's absolutely a great question. There are many inequities and systemic barriers that still exist for the queer community. We have a lot of healthcare professionals who do truly great work with the queer community here in London, but there are still barriers to healthcare. And, you know, particularly it happens for the trans community who have to travel to Toronto or Montreal to have gender affirming surgeries. You know, I guess when we take a look at healthcare, professionals, you know, they don't know what they don't know. And I don't think it's necessarily out of malice or out of disrespect, but we also need to make sure that fields of study are given, you know, some awareness, you know, of trans identities and trans health and trans realities, because this is something that, you know, an individual shouldn't have to explain their entire history every time they show up at another doctor's office. That is, you know, it's just becomes very difficult. But if we take a look at the issues that London needs to address, these are also issues that gravely impact the queer community. You know, housing, the lack of affordable and supportive housing. You know, they require immediate investment from all levels of government. You know, there are so many folks who, in living their authentic self, are cut off from their families. And youth homelessness for the 2S LGBTQIA+ community is something that is horrifying and life-changing, and you need to make sure that these folks can get support so that they can, you know, survive and thrive. Also, a lot of folks in our community live in poverty, raising the ODSP rates out of to a livable rate, because right now the levels are so low that it traps people in cycles of poverty. You know, if we also take a look at long-term care, there are folks who, in entering long-term care, who have fought their entire life to support the human rights that we now enjoy, are being forced back into the closet, you know, whether for fear for their safety, their thoughts about possibly not getting the care that they deserve. And that to me is just horrifying, to think that somebody who has, you know, really stood strong and stood proud, that they would even have to consider that sort of idea is scary. So we need to make sure that that long-term care is provided with training, and make sure that it is an affirming space where people can be their authentic selves. You know, I'd like to see more political action from the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, because our human rights are not inalienable. You know, and all it takes is a bad government. You know, a lot of people will look at, you know, a woman's right to choose, for instance, and you have to ask yourself, why does that keep coming up with different governments in different places in the world? And, you know, I fear that there are young people among us who think it's something that can never be taken away. And unfortunately, with the stroke of a pen, it's scary. I would hate to see our hard-won equity be erased with the stroke of a pen. You know, I think, but first and foremost, it's upon all of us to elevate equity voices, to make sure that we're listening and to make sure that we're learning and becoming a better people.
Thank you, Terrance. And Annalise, what is your perspective on the issue?
It's always fun going last and going after all the brilliance that just was said. So I'm not going to actually touch anything around system level change, because I think Terrance and Christopher both did a beautiful job of laying out so many examples of that. When I thought about sort of the word symbolic, it was really important to me that we don't conflate that with representation. And there's a good criticism for not stopping at the symbolic, for sure. But when I think about things that have been incredibly powerful in my own personal life, yes, sometimes they are connected to the flag flying in particular areas, and the representation of what that means. And it has to go deeper, yes. And to the representation of my family when we walk through the mall. So my wife, me, and my toddler, we're not seen in any of the ads there, and that's still, that moment would still be incredibly powerful for me to see that representation. And it sometimes is argued as symbolic, sometimes not. But I think there's power in those visual and other forms of representation. The other sort of part that came to mind as I was thinking about this was kind of back to the conversation around justice. I'd really like our hetero cisgender folks to step up a little bit. So when I think about, I went through a fertility journey to become pregnant. That was a very intentional act in our family situation. And through that process, there were lots of forms involved in different medical moments, we went with the midwifery, we sort of navigated 3 options there, lots of sort of visual representations of hetero couples and forms that included only hetero mother, father names, that kind of thing. And of course I point them out and I take that on, and that's okay. But what happened to every one of my other peers that I know, the dozens and dozens of frankly hetero women who are my friends and colleagues, did they also mention those when they went through those systems? And not to sort of finger point, but I think there's an importance there to sort of shift the onus, and to notice, like, if you're not seeing diversity represented on ads or whatever from companies beyond Pride Month, then maybe stop buying from there and take that on, even though you're not queer, even though you're not trans, or whatever that might look for you. Shift yourself in that focus, take that on.
Thank you, Annalise. We're going ahead of schedule, actually, so I'll just throw in a little question here as well that relates to the symbolic action, because actually the symbolic performative support is a big issue within diversity and inclusion movement right now. So it's a problem number 1 that is raised over and over and over again. So like, how do we actually do something meaningful instead of doing symbolic or performative things such as, performative inclusion, which stops at the recruiting process, or symbolic representation of different voices at the negotiation table, when only like 3 of them have actually actual power-making decision, things like that. And I think this is a very important point to start with, because 1, we need to understand why we do what we do. Because in many cases, people treat LGBT inclusion as something, like one of the check boxes. They kind of like, oh, we just need to, and basically that means silent tolerance, at best, in some cases. Because I mean, there's tons and tons of microaggression or indirect violence or invisible violence, if you will, that can be expressed one way or the other at the workplace or in communities, like in the community level as well. And then, so that's one thing. But then the other thing is, how do we actually, how the inclusion of LGBTQ plus folks, how is it inscribed into different types of social services and political institutions? Do we address the group as one group and find it sufficient? Or do we actually consider the diversity within the group? The different parts of the group will need different services, and then it will require different protocols and procedures for that. So if you have any comments on that, please share them. Anybody who wants to go first.
I'll throw some comments forward. It's interesting that, I know that there are many corporations and many organizations who are attempting to do the right thing, and they will offer, cultural competency training. But, it's one of those things where you don't simply get a certificate and then you're done. As we've mentioned, it's not a checkbox where you can simply say, yes, I've arrived, I've crossed that finish line, and I never need to revisit this idea again. Instead, it must be an ongoing and intentional process. And, I think as well, it's very easy to name and to call out overt forms of racism and homophobia and misogyny, whereas it can be so much more difficult to call it those microaggressions or call it this more subtle forms. And unfortunately, those are the ones that are far more insidious as well. What we need, I think, is as a people to stand united with those who have encountered historic marginalization. We take a look at Indigenous folks who are, currently under so many boil water advisories and are denied the basic services we all take for granted as Canadians. With the basic cover up of residential school children. Or if we look towards the horrific tragedy that happened here in London with the Salman Afzal family, we need to also stand united against Islamophobia. There are many hijabi women who encounter, comments, unwanted, just negative attention and, horrific events. And unfortunately, it's something that we all as a people should stand united, whether, anti-Black racism or anti-Semitism. If all people who had been denied equal treatment within the society stood together, we would be unstoppable. So I think Annalise brought this up earlier. We need to think not just of ourselves, but for people who are like us, maybe not exactly like us, but who also are equity deserving people, and make sure that we're all standing united. I frequently think of the poem that's attributed to Martin Niemöller, First They Came. And in the poem, the speaker goes through a number of different groups, and he was a pastor who was writing during Nazi Germany, and he speaks about different groups. First they came for this group, and I did not speak up, and then they came for this group, and goes through this list, and then at the very end he says, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So there's that regret that there was an opportunity for the speaker to have raised his voice, to have said something. And so the onus is upon us all to listen, to elevate voices, to make sure that we are doing better and we are actively doing better. And that's, it's not simply a tick box. It's not something where you can say, there, I'm done, that training is over. It's got to be an ongoing intentional process.
Thank you, Terrance. Annalise?
I think I'll take on the second part of what you had talked about. Do we need to sort of tease out different needs within the community and sort of focus on those separately, or can we stand somehow still collectively united? And an academic theorist that I've worked a lot with, Judith Butler, and I don't normally like to quote academic theorists, but we're going to do it for a moment, had a really powerful way of talking about their relationship to the women's movement. And they essentially said, when it's politically expedient, I will walk under the banner of woman. And when that will advance the cause that's important, I will do that. And when a sort of separation is needed, I will do that. And so I think of course, there's power in the collective voice. And so when that's politically expedient to do that, yes, but never at the harm of folks within that voice. And when it's important to tease out those voices and sort of leverage the privilege that I have behind other members of the community to do that, then we should do that.
I can't agree more. Thank you, Annalise. Christopher, do you want to add something?
Maybe just to point out, I think what Terrance said is really important in the sense of, sorry, in the sense, now I've lost my train of thought. So I'm just going to go to what I was thinking about, which is like the work that a lot of community organizations are doing right now, which is we are seeing, efforts to sort of diversify their services and to be able to offer services to different folks. I'm thinking of some community organizations in British Columbia that I've worked with that historically have been very centered on gay cis men, but are really making an effort to be able to offer services to trans folks, to non-binary folks, things that obviously a lot of them come sort of from like the healthcare sort of sector or like focus on healthcare. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, also cisgender, like gay and lesbian folks have historically been denied access to healthcare. I think that's something that continues obviously to be an issue. And it's not so much, you know, I think there's often like the fear that like if you start to offer services to more folks, then like the ones that used to be able to get service aren't getting that kind of service anymore. And I think that's really kind of like the wrong way to think about it, because it's not about competition, you know, it's like to be able to offer services to everyone in the community. And I think obviously funding and resources is a big piece of the puzzle there. So I think it's also really important to support those organizations, to make sure that those organizations have the funding to be able to expand their services. And sort of coming back to the systemic thing, it obviously also means that there's more action needed at the federal and provincial level, so that we don't have to rely just on those community organizations in the first place to provide those kinds of services.
Thank you, Christopher. And let's move to our next question, which is, what are the gaps in the LGBTQ plus community, and where does this movement need to move in the future? Where is more work needed in the future from your perspective? Let's start with Terrance this time.
You know, I think we have to be very careful and very conscious that queer spaces don't reinforce existing inequalities within, and I hate saying this word, but outside society. And that can very much be the danger. We look at the corporate sponsorship of Pride, for instance. It tends to be very focused on, you know, white cisgendered men. And, you know, it has this sort of hierarchical ideal, which is absolutely anathema to what the queer movement really ought to be and should be. You know, I think we have to make sure that, you know, politically there's access to affirmative health care, to make sure that there is access to affordable and supportive housing, and that we should also, as a community, demand better of our governments, you know, make sure that they keep their promises, hold them to account. We need to raise the minimum wage to make sure that there's actual consideration for what is known as a living wage, so that people can actually exist and thrive. You know, too many folks within the 2S LGBTQIA plus community work in the service industry, for instance, or work in low-paying gig jobs, and that is such a shame. I mean, also employability for trans folks can be so incredibly difficult, and that is something we have to change. That is a huge gap, because then they're pushed into subsistence sex work, for instance. And, you know, just, we have to, you know, I think by and large, the queer community also needs to reflect on itself and look outside itself. I mean, I think regardless of our own viewpoints, the most value is within listening to others and thinking about things in the way that they think about them. You know, the old adage of walking a mile in someone's shoes. I know that it's next to impossible to do, but I think there's tremendous value and tremendous benefit in trying. You know, that helps develop empathy, it develops understanding. So, you know, we ask that of the broader community, but we should also be taking that work upon ourselves, you know, in the ways that I was stating earlier for other, you know, equity deserving groups. I think as well that, you know, we need to realize across society, regardless, that human rights are not a zero-sum game, that one person's human rights do not take away from somebody else's. It's not like there's a pie and somebody's going to take all the pieces of pie before you get there. You know, I think it's all about making space for others. It's about admitting that we don't know all the answers. It's about learning, and it's about growing. I think that's the burden is upon all of us. You know, but it's a bad burden.
Thank you, Terrance. And Annalise, what is your perspective?
When I was thinking about this in preparation, sort of a story came to mind about my wife, Holly. So my wife Holly is a teacher, and her gender expression is one that means that she often gets read as being gay just by entering a room. And so usually her students know, and that's incredibly powerful. They will often see themselves in her. She's usually one of the only visibly out teachers in a school that she's in. But what's even more powerful is that she makes a really intentional point at the beginning of any semester in every class that she does to drop that she's also a mom and to drop that she has a kiddo. And what students who are queer, I have sort of found very anecdotally, is that there isn't really a life trajectory for them. They don't see what it will mean to be seniors who are queer because we don't see folks like that in the same way. It's not as visible. You don't know what your life possibilities are if you can't necessarily see them. And thank goodness for all of our sort of for mothers and fathers who already have begun carving that for sure, but that is still quite an unknown. And so I think, you know, being full humans, talking about our full lives beyond, you know, I'm a queer woman for sure. But for me, that means I'm also a mom. It also means I was the mom that carried and that we had to navigate certain things. And that's possible for your future if you want it to be. But I also look forward and I'm like, I don't know what it's going to be like for Holly and I when and if we are in, say, a senior's home. I don't know what that sort of life is like because I don't have visions of that in front of me that are so clear. So that sort of one sort of area that I went to is sort of the full life trajectory and how can we see ourselves in the stories ahead of us. And the other part was that not to ever deny the need to focus on, again, oppression and harms and system changes. And that can get really, really heavy and hard. And sometimes I just wish we could talk about the normalcy of my family and the joyfulness of that without ever taking away from all of the bad shit too. But can we just celebrate the normalcy and the joy and offer those stories forward as well as all the calls to arms, essentially.
Thank you, Annalise. And Christopher, would you like to say something?
Yes, and thanks, Annalise. It's so important to mention that. That really made me think about, like, yeah, how we as queer and trans people, yeah, for me it was similar the first time I went to a big conference, which is the Moving Trans History Forward conference at the University of Victoria, which happens every 2 years. And the first time I was in a room with trans people of all ages, and I saw trans people that were 60, 70, 80 years old. And I think that was the moment for me that I realized that I had not been able to see myself being trans at that age. And like, I think the work that I did with the Trans Tipping Point project was really valuable in that sense as well, as it brought together different generations of trans and gender diverse people. And it was so important, I think, for especially the youth who are like, you know, some of them are like only like 10 years old or something. And to be able to see like trans adults, you know, who like sort of like coming and working with them and like just getting to know each other and hearing about sort of their life, that's so important. And I think it's a really good point to point out that, yes, there's so much work to be done and there continues so much things that we are facing and that we need to fight against. But it's also really important to celebrate the moments of joy and to be thankful for something like pride that we have. You know, pride is obviously also complicated in its own ways. But to have that for us and to be able to now, hopefully, be able to see each other again in public with masks and to celebrate pride, I think it's probably more important than ever.
Absolutely. I just, if I may follow up on what you just said, I had a similar moment in Trans Conference in Philadelphia a couple of years ago when I saw different types of non-binary folks there. You know, it was this kind of like reassuring moment that actually there's nothing wrong with me. You know, like it has to, like, it comes in waves over and over and over again, you know, through the years, even though, like, you know, that you're fine and like everything is sort of go the way, well, not exactly that it's supposed to go, but, you know, at least you have some way to maneuver. But actually seeing a lot of people being so strong and so kind and so generous in terms of actually describing and sharing their identity and telling, how they, like what kind of problems they see, but also like what kind of things they celebrate is very empowering. And I do believe that those kind of moments, they need to happen more often. And, it will be good if we can facilitate them more. But I have a couple of difficult questions, if you don't mind. Just to spin off what you just said. What do you think about ageism in LGBTQ plus communities? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. Yeah, it's obviously an issue. I think when we think of things like that, a lot of queer folks are getting to know each other these days over dating apps, and I think like the screen between us just reinforces like all kinds of like sort of like automatic rejection, and like age is obviously one of them. It really makes me sad to see when I'm on the apps, I'm seeing so many people, who are, I mean, it's hard to guess somebody's age sometimes, but I see an unfortunate trend of people making themselves younger than they are, because obviously they fear that they will be rejected if they put their true age in, and that makes me really sad. And I think in terms of the resources, it seems to me there is a good number of resources and services for like, LGBT seniors, but again, unfortunately, those are often focused on cisgender gay men. So I'm not really seeing a lot of services, for example, for trans and seniors. I'm not seeing a lot of services for lesbian and femme older people. I'm not really seeing any services for older non-binary people. So I think that's something that we need to address, because like, yeah, I think like ageism is one of those maybe more subtle discriminations that we in the community definitely have to grapple with.
Thank you, Christopher. Annalise?
I'll take a go. I think it's interesting to think about, so I came across a poll, it's Ipsos Reid, we can all hold the pros and cons of this, but so it's an American poll that was done and of Gen Z, so below where I'm at. And only 66% of them identified exclusively as heterosexual, and 56% said that they knew someone who identifies and uses the gender neutral pronouns. And those are big shifts from definitely the boomer generation, but even the millennial generation, we're talking like 15 percentile shifts to that. Like what they know in their world and what then they think are the needs of sort of queer and trans folk is so, in a certain sense, possibly myopic. And my fear is that it will become even less visible the bigger that divide becomes over the generations, so that the older folks and the needs that they have and the histories that they've lived and the struggles that they've fought will just be so out of the scope of what is known of that younger generation. And yet, like, how amazing that those are the stats, right? But I think that will play into, and does play into, some ageism within the community for sure.
It's not to return to my comments about long-term care, but it is, we have to make sure that folks are safe and can be themselves, regardless of their age. Also, I mentioned earlier that it can always be a concern that queer spaces might replicate existing inequities in heteronormative society, and unfortunately, ageism is can be seen as being something that is almost on overdrive within the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. It's although one thing I would like to mention is when we take a look at the youth, as Annalise said, actually, as it turns out, I had Annalise's partner Holly as a speaker at an event that I had many years ago. And I was a little concerned about this event because it was for grade 8 students and they were learning about social justice topics. And Holly did a fantastic job, and some of the students are still interested in poetry, by the way. It was amazing. Seriously, like lifetime impact on some of these kids. It was phenomenal. There's another speaker who was herself a trans woman. And I was very concerned prior to the event because I thought, my goodness, here's somebody who's brave. They're sharing their truth. They're going to, stand strong. And I thought, what if the kids are unkind? And the exact opposite was true. The students were so phenomenally respectful. They were so incredibly kind. They, had some brilliant but respectful questions, and it really gives me hope that we are seeing a change within this generation. That people are starting to understand that old ways of thinking or old ways of categorizing humans is utterly wrong. That we're going to see a generation that is hopefully will learn to replace hatred with love and with understanding, that people will listen to one another, that people won't simply attack first and ask questions later. I truly hope that we will be looked after one day by a generation that understands the value of kindness above all else.
Thank you very much, Annalise and Terrance. And I really like what you just said, Terrance, this phrase that like people who attack first and listen later is really powerful, because this is what's happening for the most part in many places all over Canada. And just to follow up a little bit on the generational shift, I guess we can call it this way. It's really important because yes, the Zers, they have much, they have a different understanding of gender roles, gender identities, as well as sexual orientation and sexual identities as well. The problem is that in many cases, there's no dialogue between people who have decision-making power and the younger generation who bring new perspectives into classroom, into the workplace, into the community events, to like religious establishments as well. And I honestly have no answer to this, because like I see this problem over and over and over again, like with people I work with, like when I read different types of reports, when I read different types of recommendations. So what do we do in terms of project development and how we reach out to the LGBTQ members, just to make sure that we hear their voices and we incorporate the voices and we communicate those voices to those people who have some decision-making power? Please share your thoughts. I mean, I can start if if nobody, if you need a little more time. It's basically Christopher and myself, we co-developed the Trans Newcomers Online Resource Hub, which was administered by Mosaic BC, probably one of the largest organizations in British Columbia that works with newcomers to Canada. And that project was specifically designed to support transgender and gender diverse newcomers to Canada. And the way it was done, that we based the whole research process on the experience, like the firsthand experience of people who came to Canada. And then based of focus groups and interviews, we kind of analyzed everything and group information and issues that they addressed into sections that they were directly reflected in the online resource. And that was a very, I'm not sure if this is a unique experience, but it was a really good way to address things, because we could pinpoint things that people ask about or warn about, which is very important, because in many cases, there's so many invisible barriers that you only need to confront it in order to see it. And then, of course, when you confront it, you don't have any, sometimes you can be emotionally exhausted, but that's one thing, you have no mental resources to cope. But then it's also like you maybe need a moment to understand how to respond to this obstacle, and you may not have either time or resources again. And this is why I'm asking this question. So how do we make sure that, let's say that because the shift between generations is very visible. It's visible in everything, how people see themselves, how people see other people, how people approach to difference. And those clashes are inevitable, because right now we have 5 generations working in the workforce. And so how do we bring everybody together? And again, how do we make sure that the policies we write actually reflect the vision, the people that we try to serve?
If I may, thanks, Alex, for bringing that up. I would have mentioned that as well, in the sense of like, I think it's the crucial thing is to have really what's often called stakeholders input, you know? I think I'm thinking also about like, there are now thankfully specific agencies and, you know, and consultation organizations that you can hire that will be able to work like with a specific perspective. I have myself had, you know, trainings in the workplace that were run by agencies that are specific, representing Indigenous perspectives, or like Black and people of color's perspectives. So there are like, you know, these organizations out that you can hire and that can like, you know, give you this kind of input, and also like, yeah, organize sort of focus groups and things like that to make sure that you are able to include those perspectives. Because I think, yeah, you can like read articles, you know, and like sort of think about, try to include like everything you can think about. But at the end of the day, you have to ask the people, you know, what they are experiencing and what they are facing. And there will be many things, like you're saying, that are your personal blind spots that you would never have thought about, that only they can tell you that you need to work on that.
Thank you, Christopher. Anyone else would like to join?
I guess, you know, it's a very multifaceted question, because when we take a look at equity, we think, you know, we are all human, we're all united, we're all one, and yet there are also subdivisions of people who, you know, their intersectional identities, for instance, who might be, you know, disenfranchised or marginalized in more ways than one, which, you know, also is something that can have a profound impact on people. You know, I think that, you know, when we take a look at policies, or when we take a look at legislation, everything has to be really scrutinized with an equity lens to make sure that folks are being considered. You know, if we look at the built environment, for instance, we look at the way, you know, accessibility, for instance, the built environment is created intentionally with a conscious thought of how people will move and proceed and spend time within society. But that being said, it is built to include, or in some cases exclude, because people who may have mobility issues are not necessarily provided with a means or an avenue if they're not given a proper way to proceed through that environment. You know, there is a lot of training that is available for folks. You know, school boards are very good at making sure that they are keeping abreast of you know, of issues that educators need to know about. But again, it has to be something that is an ongoing process. It's not something to tick off on a list. I think individually and independently, the burden or the onus is upon all of us as well to interrogate ourselves, to think about our own biases, our own perspectives, and to really examine why we feel that way. I think of the work of, I think it was Katz, and it was the concept of intentional interruption. You know, as humans, we read something and we highlight all of the things that we agree with. And instead, you should be highlighting the things you disagree with, not to change your mind, but to try to actually open your mind, or to think, why is it you disagree with those things? And to really give it, you know, an honest, clear thought. You know, it's not about changing your mind, but it's at least understanding why you think the way that you do. So I think, you know, we all have, you know, a great deal, as I said, a great deal of learning to do.
Thank you, Terrance. Annalise, would you like to add something?
As soon as you raised that question, Alex, I sort of got tired. In the sense of, like, I don't have a lot of optimism to offer to this question. I feel quite pessimistic in some ways. And I think the best I can do around it, frankly, is that sort of the youth will speak with their feet. And so and that's maybe a bit passive and maybe not fully going to play out in my hopes and dreams here, but if those stats hold true, the ones that I mentioned, and there's tons more, you know, that generation can vote, and like perhaps our efforts would be best placed to reinvest them in the political system because they are highly disengaged, and maybe that's sort of the passive way of getting to where we need to go. But when I hear about, I grew up Catholic, and sort of the more recent announcement by the Vatican around same-sex marriage, and just not a lot of uptake in my circles around that issue. And then I hear about sort of the number of members of federal parliament who voted against banning conversion therapy, and it was quite a few. These are just not hopeful moments for me. And yet when I think about like how many youth do I know that are still attending Catholic church? I don't know. And not to like be super politically insensitive, but I think that there'll be some movement with their feet to process through these changes. And that's where I can be optimistic.
I agree. Thank you, Annalise. We have about 10 minutes for the, our questions before we switch to the audience. And I'm kind of torn between two questions. One is a little more optimistic and the other one is kind of more pessimistic. So which one would you like to approach?
Let's be optimistic.
Optimistic, okay. Let's talk about art. Let's talk about queer art and representation of different queer identities and different art practices, and how art can be a real mobilizer for community change. And maybe we'll start with Chris.
Thank you, Alex. Did you like handpick that question for me? That is exactly the topic of my doctoral dissertation that I'm about to undertake. So yeah, I think art is sometimes underestimated in what a catalyst for change it can be, and we can go sort of like all the way back to right after Stonewall, when we had sort of an emergence of like really like a gay and lesbian consciousness that was often expressed through art, and then obviously with the advent of the AIDS crisis, like art was such an important factor, especially like, in organizations like ACT UP, if you think about the signs and like you could all, the protests that often like involved aspects of performance art. Something that I've been really focused on, and it's really beautiful to see, is just the explosion of art activism by trans people that sort of about the last 20 years or so, and like it's really reaching like incredible heights, and there's so many international renowned artists out there now and working in all mediums, that it's really powerful. And I think like specifically when we think about issues like sexual orientation, gender identity, like art is really an interesting medium to like work through that. I think personally, also like there's a lot of like sort of healing that can happen for yourself by using art to express yourself, but it's also like a means of communication to make people understand like what you're going through. And I think that is just, that is something that is incredibly powerful. And I think it's a big part of like how change is affected actually, because we think about like how political change often happens. It's not so much, through like sort of the institutions. It's usually like the pressure from outside on these institutions that force them to change. And I think art has like always played a big part in that.
Thank you, Christopher. Terrance?
It's an excellent question, because art has always been at the forefront of political criticism and social change. I mean, it has entire epochs have been named for different art movements and for the ways in which they have helped craft and helped move public opinion. I think back to when I was a young person, and the absolute lack of any sort of queer representation on television, and then when there was some, it was often derided, and it was terrible. But really, it's changed anymore, in the media, and I think in a lot of ways that has sort of helped change the opinions and change the minds of a lot of folks, because we see folks from the 2S LGBTQIA plus community who are, living their life, and whether you're from that community or not, there's that shared human experience, even though it's sort of, often in a narrative format or it's acted, it still, helps people understand the universality of it. But also, it's quite really inspiring to see people like Demi Lovato, for instance, who's recently come out as being non-binary, and that's something that a lot of people can look towards because they're a well-known figure who is, many people have consumed their media, and it's almost as though it's a respectable voice. So even through that art form, which wouldn't necessarily be seen to be promoting equity, has really done so in just a quiet way. So I think it's really phenomenal what we've seen, and I think that is really going to impact our future as people realize, our concept of normal. What even is that?
Thank you very much, Terrance. And Annalise?
Echoing something that Christopher said, coming from the sector that I am in, so gender-based violence, art is catharsis. Like, art is part of healing. It is incredibly powerful for survivors. We use it in a therapeutic context. And so art is so incredibly important on an individual level to sort of manage the oppression, work through that space. But then to sort of get to a place of being seen, like you're seen through your very art. And so who you are, you're processing through the oppression, then you're seeing and sort of releasing who you are and your identity into that. And I thought it was a really great question to end on, Alex, because the whole panel has been mostly sort of in our minds and not in our hearts. There's been a few maybe storytelling moments, but mostly it's been in our minds. And people connect to change making through their heart. Like, that's where it really, the inception of it is. And that's the role of the arts, for sure.
Thank you very much, Annalise. And if I may, we have a little bit time before we turn to audience. I can share my personal experience with art, and I'm definitely not an artist of any kind. I'm a weird blend of a scholar and a community change maker, but I participated in a fantastic project which was created by Faye Nass, and she's a director of Frank Theatre Company in Vancouver, BC. So I was one of the co-writers for the diaspora play, which reflected queer experiences of immigrants to Canada. So there were 5 of us plus Faye co-writing the whole thing. And it's, this was exactly cathartic, exactly what you said, because like, for one thing, it was important to work through the pain and actually to say it out loud, first on paper and then to the audience, like those feelings and those things that you, in some cases, afraid to admit to yourself. And then another thing is extremely empowering to tell them to, I think there was about 200 people in the audience when we did the reading at the Vancouver Queer Festival in 2019. And then also when the original screenplay was converted into a theater play, was also very empowering to see how your words are converted into a stage speech, quote unquote, and then that influences people and bring all sorts of emotion and allow them to process what they cannot actually articulate because the culture does not give you enough outlets for that. So, and for that matter, different forms of arts, different types of language that different forms of arts allow people to invent and then communicate with is extremely important. And if anybody has any comments, please share them. And if not, we will turn to the audience questions.
So I guess at this point, if people have questions that they want to put into the chat, that's great. Otherwise, maybe if people just want to unmute to ask their questions, that might be a little quicker. If anyone would like to go ahead and unmute yourself if you've got a question for our panel. maybe if I can just make a few comments. Just thinking back to the who's at the table and how do you ensure representation at the table. That's been a really big issue with the Gender Equality Coalition. So that was one of the first things that we faced. How do we make sure that we have the right people at the table, that we have diversity at the table to decide how the coalition is going to go about its business? And so it's not an easy process. I mean, it was really a lot of reaching out to community groups to say that we would really like to have representation on the board or within the organization. And even that didn't get very good results. And so then it was a matter of really personally connecting with people and explaining what our goals are, what we're trying to accomplish. And then people would say, oh, that sounds like something we might like to be part of. And then, we did have some uptake to make sure we had some diversity, but just kind of putting out a notice saying, hey, we're open for business, come on out. It didn't really get the diversity that we were looking for. So I just wanted to share that. Trying to get those voices to the table is a bit of work. And now I'll stop because I think, Lorraine, did you want to talk?
Yeah, I had a question. I have a question about bisexuals, because I think bisexuals often feel erased and even unwelcome, even in queer spaces, especially if they have a partner who identifies as the so-called opposite sex. And I know a number of bisexuals who would say they didn't pick a side, they picked a person, but they're often accused, even within queer spaces, of having picked the other side. And I didn't hear them talk about it all tonight. And I just want to ask the panel, how can the LGBTQ plus community become a more welcoming space for people who identify as bisexual? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Who would like to answer this?
Lorraine, that's an excellent question, and it really is. It is such a shame. Again, it's unfortunately that the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, which should be so open, it should be so welcoming, it should be so understanding. Unfortunately, it's bisexual folks often are doubly marginalized. They cannot find the understanding and love that they deserve within the community outside of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, and then within it, it's that double disenfranchisement, which is completely and utterly wrong, because really it's I think what it comes down to for me is always listening to the person and listening to where somebody has come from, and you should never judge first. But I think what would be required, and maybe to go back to one of our last questions, is we need more representation in terms of art forms and showing that these are just ways to love that may not be for everyone, but they are nonetheless human and nonetheless part of somebody's life, and something that we should try to understand, because this sort of this human way of trying to put all of our knowledge into these preformed buckets is so depersonalizing and is so dehumanizing, and it really takes away what it means to be a human. I mean, it's that sort of binary thinking, that sort of oppositional idea, that idea that there's some sort of right and wrong, black and white. And in this world, we all know that there are so many shades of gray, and it is through listening that we can understand a unique perspective. But you pointed at something that is absolutely right. I mean, that's the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, Ida Hot B, is one that's it needs more attention. It absolutely does.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree. Annalise, Christopher, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quoting somebody else, and I can't remember who it was, but unfortunately, I think often where sort of biphobia comes from is actually misogyny, in the sense that like somebody who identifies as male is assumed to be really only gay, whereas like somebody is female, identifies as female and is bisexual is often assumed to be like really straight. So I think that often is like really like the root issue is it's not so much like, you know, it is misogyny. So I think that's something that also like obviously is something that needs to be addressed within the community, because unfortunately there is, you know, also a lot of like misogyny, trans misogyny that we're seeing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
I don't have any brilliance to add other than thanks for pointing that out, Lorraine. And yes, Terrance and Christopher, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annalise. And I think we're ready for our next question. Linda, would you like to read it?
Sure, I can read it. So it's from Sylvie, and it says, my question's a little different. What do you believe are the important leadership skills that will intentionally cultivate improvement in diversity, inclusiveness, and equity, specifically to decrease the gap? So any thoughts?
I think that list could be long and well detailed. I will just start off and then others can sort of add to that. I think a really deep reflective understanding of your own privilege and sort of positionality, and starting from that vantage point and then constantly reflecting on where that brings forward moments where you haven't thought something through correctly and stepping into the discomfort of that. And then secondly, like cliche, but lifelong learner, like this is going to be a constant act. A constant engagement with new material, new identities, new things you didn't know, and the yearning to do that learning needs to sort of be at the fore.
You know, the way I look at it is, you know, it's the way we all do. We all come at things with our own independent, our own unique perspective. You know, myself to represent the community of London North Centre as an out and proud gay man is, you know, I think that's something that has, you know, I've heard from my former students, and it's had such an impact. They can see themselves in that, regardless of where they come from. And I think, you know, that is where representation does matter. But that means that, you know, folks have an obligation and a responsibility to ensure that they're elevating equity voices, to make sure that they are being provided a seat at the table, making sure that they're sharing their truth. And it's not a matter of us saying, oh, I've been through something just like that, blah, 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 but actually listening with an open heart, and not just a nodding head and a smile, but actually trying to see that person reflected in you and you reflected in them. You know, we have such tremendous work to do, as Annalise said, with lifelong learning. And it's also, I like especially what you said, Annalise, about being okay with that discomfort, stepping into that discomfort and being okay with not knowing. You know, as we grow and progress into this thing called adulthood, everybody does not like to admit that they do not know. And yet there, if anything, as we grow older, we should know how abundantly little we know. In fact, it's almost as though we have so much more as our perspective broadens and our universe gets larger and larger.
Thank you, Terrance.
I actually wonder if I can jump in one more point I had. Christopher, not to cut you off if you're also wanting to. Okay. And it just linked to, Linda, what you had started us off with, is sort of the struggle of getting voices at the table. And an unpopular opinion, perhaps, but one that I think is important to sit with in the discomfort of it is, do we need to pay folks for that expertise? Lived experience of marginalization is a form of knowledge and expertise. And so often many of us are constantly asked to provide that in free forums and sort of ways, and that's giving away of our talents. And I think that if there's ways of structuring the validation of that through payment, that will have tangible repercussions on EDI efforts.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think when I'm thinking about that, those are leadership skills, but they're also like life skills, like, you know, human being skills, in the sense of like, if you think about something as simple as like, if you think about your circle of friends, like, you know, who they are, what they look like, you know, are they all white? Are they all cisgender? Are they all straight? You know, what kind of like experiences from other people are you having in your life, you know, like sort of outside of like maybe the workplace where you don't have a lot of like agencies, but like if you think about the areas of your life where you do have agencies to bring in those other perspectives and then learn from other people, I think that's a really important thing to think about, like in terms of like, you know, getting to know people whose experiences are very different from yours.
Thank you, Christopher. I may just, if I may, I have a couple of points to make that echo everyone's answer. One, I also believe that good leadership requires vulnerability. Not only having it, but also owning it, just to make sure that you're strong enough in your position that you're not afraid to share your difference in a powerful way. And then when it comes to tokenizing vulnerable experiences, unfortunately, this is a big topic in diversity and inclusion. And there's no one way to resolve the problem, but there, like some organizations actually rewrite the policies in a way that they say that marginalized people are not responsible for educating their coworkers. It needs to go in writing. It needs to be discussed over and over and over again, because it will happen. And there's nothing, for one, it's traumatizing and re-traumatizing. And two, it's also like a demeaning and tokenizing experience, because you become nothing but that particular segment of your identity. And of course, everybody is much more complex than that. And so one of the suggestions that many EDI professionals put forward is that it will be better to see a person before a policy. So see a person who you write a policy for, instead of just focus on procedural aspects. And I'm not sure, like, I don't know if we have time for another question, or shall we go to our final remarks?
If there's anybody that would like to speak, I'll just let that happen. Maybe our speakers, if our audience doesn't have any questions, perhaps we might want to have our speakers just do a final wrap up of any comments that they'd like to make as they wrap up.
Maybe we'll start with Terrance again.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. And, you know, I'd very much like to thank the Coalition to Empower Gender Equality for having me this evening. I think these are important discussions for us to have and to continue to have. I've got my hat is off to Annalise and Christopher for just their truly wise words and moving words. You know, I think as human beings, we are kind of like, I always use the analogy of old map makers or cartographers who would go and explore and chart the world. As human beings, we're kind of the same. Old cartographers used to place monsters upon unexplored waters or places that hadn't been investigated. And I sometimes wonder if we're the same, that the things that we have not chosen to apprehend with our minds are the other, or somehow scary, or somehow perhaps a monster. And really, it's up to us to make sure that we are listening to folks and doing our best to understand folks, and making sure that we are not also responsible for that othering. You know, regardless of where we come from, you know, we have ears to listen and a heart to feel. And if we do so, we can change the world. So I'd like to thank you all for doing your part tonight for changing the world, and for all the work that you do in the community and making sure that we're just getting better and better. Thank you.
Thank you, Terrance. And Annalise?
Oh goodness, that was very eloquent, Terrance. And the use of a metaphor. It was, yeah, I don't have that to provide. I'm just really grateful for this conversation, for the sort of diversity of voices in it. And that there were really truly moments where we did get into our heart a little bit. And that was sort of the most poignant that I'll take away. So thank you for hosting this and for providing this.
Thank you very much, Annalise. And Christopher.
Yeah, I mean, what can I add? Like, yeah, thank you so much, Alex and Linda and everybody for hosting us. Thank you, Annalise and Terrance, for being on this panel. It was really informative, and I learned so much from both of you just listening to you. I do want to maybe make one comment, and I know, like, in one of the answers to the questions, I said that I didn't really think there was something like a queer and trans community. But I do think on the rare moments that we are able to form that community, we are really so truly powerful and can, like Karen said, like change the world. So I think that's the ideal, that's the utopia we just need to work towards too.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And if I may, I would love to thank Annalise, Terrance, and Christopher once again. Thank Linda, Amanda, Jordan, who's behind the scenes for organizing these fantastic events. And I hope it was as enjoyable and delightful for you as it was to me. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I'd like to thank Alex for your very professional presentation here. Thank you so much for moderating this evening. Thank you, Jordan, for bringing us all in and out of the meeting so seamlessly. Thank you so much to our speakers for your professional, wonderful, wonderful opinions and thoughts. Thank you to the audience. Thank you all for attending this evening. I've got just a couple little things here before you all run away. Just reminders of things to come, that we do have the August speaker event coming up, and we're going to be talking about Indigenous cultures and gender equality. So how that intersects with Indigenous cultures. That'll be on August the 19th at 7 p.m. Mark your calendars. We hold the speaker series the third Thursday of the month, and we have that event is open this evening and ready, so you can register if you like on Eventbrite this evening. Secondly, we do have an event happening in September with our founding organization, the Canadian Federation of University Women, and they're having an event called The Gathering, and it'll be on September the 1st at 7 p.m. on Zoom. And that event will be all of the London organizations that are doing things here in London and what they're doing and how they're doing it. These are just some of the potential organizations that we will be inviting to speak and tell us what's going on with them in the coming year and how Londoners can get involved. We do have an event that we're hosting in September, so we will not have a September speaker event after saying it's the third Thursday. The only exception is September. So we invite you to join September 1st with the CFUW or and our September 30th one-day conference, which will be bringing men to the table. And so it's intentional inclusion. And we have our keynote speaker, Michael Kaufman, will be there for the White Ribbon Campaign. We will also have breakout rooms with subject matter experts on a variety of subjects that will be covered, and you'll be able to pick a number of breakout rooms and attend those in the afternoon. And we have an application ready now, and it's on our website. Jordan, I don't know if you can put that in the chat, but it's equalitycoalition.ca is our website. And you can go on there, and there is no charge for the first year of membership. And we invite you to become a member of the coalition. And so that's the upcoming events and joining the membership. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a wonderful evening.